A major victory for justice, fairness, the rule of law, but we should not succumb to the temptation to just move on and let bygones be bygones and forget about the injustice and persecution Penny suffered as if, the not guilty verdict means there's no harm and no foul. Penny's acquittal is a credit to the jury, which ultimately made the right choice in spite of the media pressure and also the violent threats from the crazed mob of BLM protesters outside and around the country. But justice is happening here in spite of the court system in New York, in spite of the corrupt far-left prosecutor, and in spite of the judge. So let's go back and review what happened just in the last couple of days before this verdict was decided. Of course, as we've been following this, we've talked about all the corrupt, crazy things that have happened in this trial and before it. But we haven't talked about the most outrageous bit of maneuvering that happened, because it happened on Friday. And then we have the verdict this morning. There was an attempt, a rather desperate one at the last minute, to rig this trial once and for all against Penny. It failed, but we should remember it and we should talk about it. And before we do, I want you to remember back to the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, when one of the arguments we heard over and over again was that Rittenhouse had unlawfully carried a firearm across state lines. PolitiFact published a whole fact check asserting that it was false to claim that Rittenhouse had any legal right to possess his AR-15 in Kenosha. Don Lemon, meanwhile, claimed that Rittenhouse was a, quote, white teenager who crossed state lines with an AR-15 style rifle. Joe Scarborough said, quote, he crossed state lines with an AR-15. Various members of Congress made the same claim, clearly implying that there was something sinister, even illegal, about Rittenhouse possessing and transporting his firearm. Now, ultimately, the entire narrative fell apart, and not just because Rittenhouse never actually crossed state lines with an AR-15. Shortly before jury deliberations began in Rittenhouse's murder trial, the prosecution was forced to admit that under Wisconsin law, Rittenhouse had every legal right to possess his rifle. That's because the rifle barrel of Rittenhouse's AR-15 was longer than 16 inches, which is the minimum barrel length that Wisconsin state law allowed. So, with very little fanfare, after months of lying by the press, the judge dismissed the gun charge against Rittenhouse before the jury could ever consider it. Now, the reason I bring that up is because that's the normal procedure that occurs in a criminal trial before the judge sends the jury to deliberate. It's the kind of thing that happens when the judge is interested in a fair trial, as the Rittenhouse judge was. Before the jury gets the case, there's an effort to make sure that the jury is considering a specific slate of charges that are well-founded in the law. You want to clarify exactly what charges the defendant is facing prior to sending the jury away to deliberate. Otherwise, if you start removing or adding charges after deliberations have begun, then you risk confusing the jury and sending signals that are obviously unfair to the defendant. This is the kind of thing that fair prosecutors and fair judges just simply would never do. What happened in the Daniel Penny case on Friday, on the other hand, demonstrated once again that neither the judge nor the prosecutors were remotely concerned about basic principles of fairness. Now, fortunately, the jury apparently was, but the judge and prosecutor weren't. So after several days of deliberation in the Penny case, the jury announced on Friday that it was deadlocked on the second-degree manslaughter charge, which requires the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Penny deliberately disregarded a serious risk of causing death to Jordan Neely, and that Penny did not act in self-defense. In response, the judge sent the jury back for some more deliberations to make sure that they were actually deadlocked. This is called an Allen charge or a dynamite charge, and it's normal in many jurisdictions when a jury says they can't reach a verdict, including in New York. The judge will send them back and say, try again. And that part is normal. The idea is to remind jurors that it's important that they try to reach a unanimous verdict, if at all possible, without forcing them into finding one. And then after receiving this Allen charge, the Penny jury came back and confirmed that indeed they were deadlocked on the first count. They could not reach a verdict. The jury didn't return any verdict on the lesser included charge of criminally negligent homicide, which requires that the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Penny should have known he was posing some deadly risk to Jordan Neely, even if he didn't deliberately and consciously ignore that risk. It also requires that the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Penny was not acting in self-defense. Now, at this point, the actually appropriate and lawful thing for the judge to do after they came back a second time and said we can't reach a verdict is to declare a mistrial. That's why we have a mistrial. It's for these exact scenarios. That's what should happen when a jury repeatedly says they can't reach a verdict after deliberating for several days and after the judge does his best to remind them of the importance of finding a verdict. Any other result risks influencing the jury and suggesting that they should reach a certain outcome. And it also happens to be inconsistent with New York law. But instead of declaring a mistrial, on Friday, the judge, whose name is Maxwell Wiley, decided to do something that, by his own admission, doesn't have any precedent in his state. So he dismissed the manslaughter charge entirely. Again, after it had already gone to jury deliberate, the jury had been deliberating that charge for 4 days, dismissed that charge and left the criminally negligent homicide charge intact. And then he told jurors to come back for more deliberations on Monday, which is what they did this morning. But this, again, is what was happening on Friday. And watch.
The judge has now dismissed the manslaughter charge against Daniel Penny after jurors came back a second time to announce that they were indeed deadlocked. Now the jury will consider a lesser charge against Penny, who was charged in the subway chokehold death of Jordan Neely last year. So I want to bring in criminal defense attorney Mark Eiglarsh. Mark, are you surprised that the jurors were not able to come to a unanimous decision on the more serious charge?
No. When you bring politically based charges, that's what happens. Meaning, I think that prosecutors normally wouldn't bring a case like this, dismissing his actions as one of mere negligence, but not criminal negligence. What outrages me, candidly, is that the judge is sending them back again to deliberate. Every jury, and I've been trying cases for 32 years, they're told if they don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt as to the main charge, consider the lesser charge. Well, they did. For 4 days and 18 hours, 7 women, 5 men considered the main charge and then the lesser charge. Now sending them back, it almost implies that the judge is saying, all right, there may be something to this lesser charge, so go back there and consider it again.
Now, what's not captured in that CNN segment is that by the judge's own admission, what he was doing in the Penny case has no precedent. It's not just lawyers and CNN commentators who are saying this. As the judge put it himself, quote, I'll take a chance and grant the prosecution's application. Yes, the judge actually said that. He said he'll take a chance and implement a novel application of criminal law by dismissing the manslaughter charge while retaining a lesser included offense. So basically, he's admitting that he's conducting a little legal experiment in the middle of a homicide trial. He's throwing out the established rules and effectively allowing the prosecution to change their strategy after jury deliberations have already begun, where the prosecution realizes it's not going their way. And so in the middle of deliberations, they want to completely change the way they approach it. Let's talk about something that affects all of us, taxes. The October 15th deadline is passed, and if you're not prepared, you could be in for a world of hurt. Do you owe back taxes? Are your returns still unfiled? Did you miss the deadline to file for an extension? Well, now that we're past October 15th, the IRS is probably gearing up for some aggressive enforcement. And trust me, you don't want to be on their radar. We're talking wage garnishments, frozen bank accounts, or even property seizures. It's not pretty, folks, but before you start panicking, there's still hope. Tax Network USA has helped taxpayers save over $1 billion in tax debt and filed over 10,000 tax returns. These guys specialize in reducing tax burdens for hardworking Americans like you. Look, I get it. Dealing with the IRS is about as fun as a root canal, but ignoring the problem won't make it go away. So here's what you got to do. Don't wait any longer. For a complimentary consultation, call today at 1-800-958-1000 or visit their website at tnusa.com/Walsh. Their experts will walk you through a few simple questions to see how much you can save. That again is 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Walsh today. Don't let the IRS take advantage of you. Get the help you need with Tax Network USA. Now, this was clearly a violation of Daniel Penny's constitutional rights. He has the right to be treated like every other criminal defendant under the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. But the prosecution and the judge abandoned that principle for the most flagrantly political reasons imaginable. Instead of the jury getting an Allen charge, they're now being told to conduct a whole new set of deliberations with new rules. Now, to give you a sense of why this was such a significant ruling, Take a look at the verdict form that the jury was considering. Here it is. You can see it on the screen. It begins by stating that if the jurors find Daniel Penny guilty of manslaughter, then they're done. They don't have to consider the lesser included charge of criminally negligent homicide. But then the form goes on to state that, quote, if you find the defendant not guilty of count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, for the reason that the people have failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not justified, then you must not consider count 2, criminally negligent homicide, and you must also find the defendant not guilty of that count. Now the form continues, quote, if you find the defendant not guilty of count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, for some reason other than a lack of justification, then proceed to consider and render a verdict on count 2, criminally negligent homicide. So what this is saying is that if the jurors found that Penny was justified and acted in self-defense to protect himself or others on that subway car, then a not guilty verdict on the manslaughter charge means that there also must be a not guilty verdict on the criminally negligent homicide charge. That's a pretty clear logical progression. Self-defense is a total defense on both charges, not just one of them. But now, very abruptly, the jury was being asked to throw out this whole logical progression. These instructions basically were revised after the fact. Now they're being asked to consider the charge for criminally negligent homicide in isolation from the other charge, which is the exact opposite of what they were told when they went into deliberation. Now again, it's impossible to ignore the natural effect that this was meant to have on the jury. The message was very clear. The judge was essentially telling the jury to compromise and convict on something. He all but said to them, okay, if you don't want that one, then just do this one. Now, officially, the judge's reasoning was that in most other cases, there's a, quote, very clear difference between the primary charge and the lesser included charge. But he said that's not the case in this trial. So that's why he says he allowed the prosecution to dismiss one of the charges while keeping the other after the jury had already deliberated. This is a move that can politely be described as novel, as the defense attorneys put it. More accurately, it's a sleight of hand that undermines the legitimacy of the entire criminal court system. But the state of New York is evidently willing to sacrifice the legitimacy of its judicial system, whatever's left of it anyway, in order to punish Daniel Penny by any means necessary. And yet they still failed, because God is good and truth wins in the end. Now, not that it really needs to be said, but the point of laws, especially criminal laws, is not to be novel. It's to establish rules that apply to everybody so that they can be enforced fairly without regard to politics. Once prosecutors start bending the rules and coming up with creative ways to imprison American citizens, it's clear they're not really concerned with justice. They are activists who want to punish their political enemies, and in New York, the judges are activists too, so they go along with it. Last week we talked about the prosecutor in this case, Assistant Manhattan District Attorney Daphne Yoren. Just a few years ago, she dramatically reduced the sentence of a black man who brutally killed an Asian man during an ATM robbery because she said that she felt sorry for the trauma in his life. She didn't want to apply the law, which clearly applied to the assailant's conduct, because she wanted to try out a novel concept called restorative justice. In the Penny case, this same prosecutor is using a novel approach for the opposite reason. She decided this time around to go out of her way to punish a defendant in a homicide case. She employed every legal technicality in the book and some that aren't in the book to throw him in prison. In fact, that's the thing. She came up with new technicalities that have never been attempted before. And it's not hard to see why that is. Sure, Daniel Penny acted in self-defense, unlike the ATM robber. Sure, Jordan Neely was a menace to society, unlike the professor who was murdered while he was just trying to withdraw money from the ATM. But also, unlike the ATM robber, Daniel Penny is white. And for that reason, and that reason alone, the jury in this case was forced to continue deliberations even after they said they couldn't come up with a verdict. The judge and the prosecutors refused to drop the case long after it's clear that they're legally obligated to do so. Now, ultimately, again, thankfully, they failed in their scheme. The whole thing backfired, actually. It was a massive backfire because now they can't retry Penny for the charge that was dismissed because they dismissed it after deliberations began. So double jeopardy protections apply. Obviously, they can't retry him on the charge that he was just acquitted of. So he's done. They